Another thing I'd like to ask you, if you're late, I'd much rather have you be here than not be here. But if you come in late, I prefer you come in through the back so that you don't disrupt the rest of the class. But, okay. So we're moving through animal groups, and as we go on from one file to the next, we'll see eventually, probably by the end of this lecture, that trend towards complexity is illustrated by looking at how each of these phyla solves the problems of living. And so we looked at poriferans, fairly simple animal, no organs, no tissues, no real cell layers. They're multicellular, and they're filter feeders, and they basically spend their whole life, filtering muck out of the seawater, and that's good enough for them. They're happy about that. Okay, they're asymmetrical. Then we move to the cnidarians, and in cnidarians we have the situation where we have now definite tissues. We have two tissues, an outer layer and an inner layer. We have radial symmetry, so they're not asymmetrical, they're radially symmetrical. They have a nerve net. They have specialized tissues doing different things. And so, again, more complex than the earlier groups. We're going to spend the rest today basically talking about we're going to be talking about worms. There's a lot of things in the animal kingdom that are referred to as worms. So worm is basically something that's longer than it is wider. Now, we're going to talk about basically early, middle, and late evolution, looking at 3 different phyla. Now, right off the bat, we have a major shift in the symmetry of the group. Cnidarians are radial. Again, they work on a theme of circular, round, spherical, whatever. Worms, and for the most part everything else after that, have a different kind of symmetry. It's referred to as bilateral, means 2 sides, and in that it's kind of an elongated. Well, let me put some more little details on it. Okay. This is not a worm, by the way. Okay. So here we have a bilateral. Now, what's a bilateral? It's an animal that has one length. The length is greater than the width. It has now only one plane of equal dissection, and that is the mid-sagittal. There's only one way to divide this animal into 2 equal parts, and then you're looking at the back of it, it's slicing it right down the middle, so you have a left and a right. Any other way doesn't do it for us. Once we get to bilateral, things kind of come together. So as soon as we have a bilaterally symmetrical animal, we now have an anterior end, a front end, and a back end, right? We have a dorsal end and a ventral underneath. We have a left and we have a right. We don't have that in a radially symmetrical animal. If I was to give you a basketball, which is a radially symmetrical piece of equipment, I said, okay, point to the front end of that basketball or the left end or the bottom, and you couldn't do it because it doesn't have one. Okay, it's radially symmetrical. Bilateral symmetrical animals have front and back, left and right, ventral and dorsal. Now, why is this such a big deal? Well, this is a big deal because it's associated with directed motility. Most of the animals we've talked about, with the exception of the jellyfish, are sessile as adults. They don't move. They stick in one place. Okay? And so let's say this is a sea anemone. It's anchored to the ground here. substrate, it encounters the environment by having things move towards it. So if you get a current of water and it has something in it, that current of water can come from any direction. It sits there and has to deal with the environment as it happens. It doesn't have a choice. Now, bilateral and motile together means this animal is capable of moving towards something that's favorable and away for something that's not. Now, why is there an association? Now, this is not going to be a rhetorical question, and I'm going to answer it for you. I want you to think about this, okay? Why is there such an association with bilateral symmetry and motility? What do they have to do with each other? They seem like totally different things, right? One's movement, one's the shape. Okay, imagine you're in a fluid, seawater, and what does it take to move? Just in general. If you're moving, what are you spending? Energy, right? And one thing about biological systems, energy is always limited. In no system is there an excess of energy. Energy is really limited. And so that phenotype, which we'll talk about this when we talk about evolution, but that phenotype, that shape, which spends the less energy to do the same thing, is going to be the one that's going to leave more offspring and survive. Okay, so let's say you're in a viscous fluid, which is water, and you're going to have two different shapes of animals. One like that, and one like that. And they're going to get from here to here, and they're the same mass. Which one's going to expend more energy? Listen, which one's going to spend least energy? You have two choices. Now I don't have a clicker, so you're going to man up and you're going to vote with your hands. Okay, this is scary stuff. Okay, how many people think? The question is, which one of these is going to do it with the least amount of energy? A or B? Okay, how many people think A? Be brave. Okay, come on. If you believe it, stand by it. Nobody believes that, right? How many people believe B? Okay, now when you raise your hand, that means I'm willing to tell me why. Why is that?
Because I think it's because one, the elongated one, it will be able to have less resistance against water, and two, it's built better to actually.
Okay, that's good. Stop right there. Okay. Now that's assuming this, right? Assuming it's going to move like this with the small edge through. Now if it moves like this, how long will that phenotype last? Not very long, right? Okay, so what's causing the expenditure of energy? It's for this animal to go from here to here, it has to push away water, right? This has to push away a lot less water around it than this, because it has a broader exposed surface here. Here's this, here's this. So motility and bilateral symmetry go hand in hand, because the thinner you are on one end, the less energy you have to spend to get to point A to B. Now why do you want to go to A to B? All kinds of reasons. Find food, find suitable habitat, find mates, avoid predators. All kinds of really good reasons to be able to move. Okay, so now you have this animal, it's moving. Technically it can move in either direction, right? Let's just say it's moving in this, always moves in this direction. Another thing associated with bilateral symmetry and motility is a thing called cephalization. What is that? Well, let's think about this. If this animal is moving along and it's encountering new environmental situations, right? Because where it is now, it has one set of environmental conditions. A meter down the road, it has other kinds of they're different. They're going going to be different. And if those environmental changes are harmful, it needs to avoid those, right? Or else what? It becomes dies, and then of course there's no fitness involved. Okay, so what kind of things are used by animals to detect environmental conditions? We're packed with them. Give me some kind of an organ or structure that has what? Neurons. Well, neurons not necessarily detection, but eyes, okay, for photo. Skin for tactile. Mouth for chemical. Okay, nose for chemical. Okay, those are in general called sense organs, right? And basically they involve, for one reason, is to detect environmental changes. Now the neural is important because that's how you integrate them. But before you integrate, you have to have something to integrate. Okay, so you have two phenotypes. We've already eliminated him. This phenotype has, they're supposed to be the same. This phenotype is unable to detect the changes in the environment. This one is. So which one do you think is going to survive on chance survive more than the, well, clearly this one. Because if it can detect changes, then at least has something, it can do something about it. Okay, so sense organs are highly adaptive. They really increase the survivorship of the organism possessing them. Okay, now we got a bunch of big packet of sense organs. Where are we going to put them? We're going to put them, define front. The front is that part of the organism that first encounters the new environment, right? Okay, so we're going to pack them right here. We're going to put tactile receptors for touch. We're going to be chemoreceptors for chemicals, photoreceptors for light. Why is that? Well, clearly, if it's a harmful situation, it doesn't want to do any good to put them here. The animal's already in it, right? So you put them up as front as you can. So you pack your front end with sense organs. Now let's go back to the neuron thing. Detecting changes in the environment isn't enough. You have to be able to respond. And the way you respond is take that information, process it, send it to muscles or other structures that are used for locomotion, for movement. Okay, so that's a nervous system. It just makes sense to have the nervous system especially concentrated where the sense organs are, because that's where all the information is coming from, right? So, cephalization is the concentration of sense organs and nervous tissue towards the front or anterior end, okay, of an animal. Why don't you see cephalization, why don't you see cephalization in radially symmetrical animals? A couple of reasons. Give me one.
Because they can move in any direction.
Well, they can move in any direction or not move at all, right? So there's no front end, so the environment can, in other words, they get changes in the environment because the environment's coming to them, and they can be coming to them in any direction, right? Okay. Now, so bilateral symmetry is tightly associated with motility. Motility is tightly associated with cephalization. Okay. Now so this is all kind of theoretical stuff. Now let's put some flesh and bones on this thing. Not bones, just flesh. They don't have bones. Okay, so the first group of bilaterally symmetrical animals we're going to talk about, are the platyhelminthes. Helminth is Greek for worm. Platy means flat, like a platter is a flat piece of kitchenware. Okay, so these are literally the flat worms. They have a couple of neat things that we haven't seen yet, I haven't really talked about. One, I have talked about, they're bilaterally symmetrical. They have 3 tissue layers. The Nigerians only had 2. They have, so they're plastic. They have an endoderm, an ectoderm, and something in the middle, which is a mesoderm. Every other animal after this has that same thing. They are motile because they have muscles, muscle tissue, which when contracted causes them to move, but they also move by cilia. Their ventral surfaces that have cilia. They're cephalized. I'm going to devolve this guy, take his legs out from under. But eliminate it with it. Okay. What is this? Okay, this is a what? This is the probably the classic high school and in college organism. Anybody ever see something that looks like that? Cross-eyed little thing, flat, dorsal ventrally flat. Okay. So it's okay. What is this thing? Anybody? Am I that bad at drawing that doesn't some kind of interest? What is it? It's a name. It's an aquatic animal. Should put that down. Aquatic, freshwater animal. Swims around. Close. There we go. That looks just like one. How can you guys not see that? That's a planarian. Okay. That's a member of the flatworms. And it's highly cephalized. It's got photoreceptors. It's got chemoreceptors. It's got tactile receptors. It can even detect the force of gravity, gravitational fields. It's motile. It has nerve cords. Part of the cephalization means it's got sense organs plus nerve cords. It's dorsal ventrally flattened. So in cross-section it looks sort of like that. It has a gut, and it's branched. If you look at it, surface like the gut, okay, is highly branched. Now, okay, so it has a gut, but it's kind of an early gut. It's called an incomplete gut. It's incomplete because it only has one opening. Okay? So it has a long kind of a tube-like structure that sucks up stuff from the bottom, processes it, gets rid of the waste products through the same place that it picked it up. So it has one opening gut. That's what they call it, an incomplete gut. Okay. Again, these are aquatic. A lot of freshwater ones. There's a lot of marine ones. There's even, believe it or not, there's even a terrestrial, a land-living planaria. It's about that big. It's iridescent blue and yellow. Freaky thing. It's found in the montane cloud forests of Australia, well, New Guinea. And coming across a planaria, crawling across a dead log is something that's pretty spectacular. But most of the time they're aquatic because they're not very resistant to drying. I mean, they dry up pretty fast. Okay, so this is a nice classic Platyhelminthes. Again, it feeds off of small animals, decaying plant and animal material. It's got two relatives. Now this belongs to the class Turbularian. And these are all free-living, meaning they're non-parasitic, basically what I've described. There's two other classes that belong to that same group that started with that. This is probably the original Platyhelminthes was a Turbularian type. These are both the trematodes and the cestodas have some of the basic features of the phylum. They're flat, they're elongated. This one has an, these are both parasites, endoparasites. And anytime parasitism evolves, a parasite is an organism, an endoparasite is an organism that lives inside and feeds off of a host organism. Oftentimes killing it, sometimes it takes a long time, but clearly harming it because it's taking nutrients from the host. That results in, anytime you have a parasitic situation, that results in a kind of an interesting evolution, a change in terms of the overall body shape and structure. So if you look at a trematode, and the trematodes are flukes. They're kind of leaf-shaped. I mean, you can imagine they came from a turbularian. They have an attachment here at one end. They have a very simple gut. It's not very branched. And they have a couple of things that are less complicated than their ancestors, which usually, the farther advanced you are, you're supposed to be more complicated. But when you have parasites, that's not true. The gut is much simpler than the turbularian gut is all branched. This is a straight shot here. This thing doesn't move. It's immobile. Its cephalization it doesn't have an eye spots, for example. It has very little cephalization. Okay, so you have reduced gut, reduced cephalization. It doesn't move. Now, why should that not? Somebody try to explain that de-evolution. It's simpler than its ancestor. How come? This is a simpler organism than its ancestor. Why? What's going on?
Because if it's a parasite, then it has something else to do it for it.
If it's a parasite, that's it. For one thing, it doesn't need to digest its food because it's absorbing the food from its host, so it doesn't need a fancy digestive system. Okay. Also, what about the sensory? Why would it be reduced cephalization?
Because its host is trying to protect itself.
Well, it has other things, like it has a cuticle protection and stuff, but I'm talking about just cephalization. Okay, let's imagine, okay, this is a liver fluke. It lives in the tissue of the liver, okay? What is there to see inside a liver? Nothing, right? Imagine yourself, you know what a liver is, crawling inside a big old, let's say a whale liver, okay, hanging out. Well, you're not going to need to see because there's nothing to see. You're embedded in animal tissue, okay? So the environment is absolutely constant. And so having fancy schmancy sense organs are not going to do you any good. There's nothing to see, right? Basically, nothing to hear, nothing to smell, nothing to touch. And so what's the positive advantage for having sense organs if you don't need them? There's none. What's the cost of having them? Energy and raw materials. Remember, one of the constancies in biology is energy is always going to be limiting. So if this liver fluke had really sophisticated visual apparatus like its ancestor did and all this other stuff, it's not going to hurt it. But of course, it's spending energy for things that's not going to do it any good. Okay. The cestoda are the tapeworms. They've even gone farther than the flukes. They're also endoparasites. Flukes can be found anywhere, in the brain, in muscle, in liver, in heart. They're nasty. Okay. Tapeworms are very sophisticated endoparasites. They attach to the gut. They do so, they have a front end. Looks like this. Then a series of kind of, these aren't really segments, they're pseudosegments. This is called the scolex. These are all proglottids. And these tapeworms, I mean, they can be the classic picture of some 13-year-old kid standing there and it's like a pile of tapeworms as tall as his arm, and from there to the bottom. So they get really long. Okay. And they attach, with these hooks attached to the digestive system and absorb nutrients from the host. There's no digestive system at all. Flukes had a reduced one, or these guys have none. Virtually no, I can't say absolutely no, but virtually no sensory system. The nervous system is completely degenerate. And so they make a living by attaching two hosts, and then they bud off these things by asexual reproduction, and then these things break off, get carried through the digestive system out, get eaten by some other animal, and then that process starts over again. Okay, so anytime you see parasites, you see two things. You see a reduction in sensory systems, and then you see modifications for rapid reproduction when you can, asexual reproduction. Okay.
Would you consider tapeworms mobile or?
Well, I mean, they're being carried by the digestive system. Now, these things are sophisticated because they don't, a lot of times don't outright kill the host, whereas flukes do. Flukes are causing more of acute problems than tapeworms. So why is that a good thing? Why does that show that they're more sophisticated, more advanced than their tapeworm, their fluke cousins?
You kill your host when you don't have anything to eat.
You, of course, killing your host, again, you just cut off the food trough. Okay? So, in fact, and this is not that long ago, I mean, I read it last several years, for more morbidly obese patients, sometimes under doctor's supervision, they're given tapeworms, okay, which infect the patient, reducing the amount of nutrients that are absorbed, and then when the person loses the weight that they need, you can add chemicals to get rid of the parasite. Okay? Because they really don't do much harm except for robbing the host of nutrients. I think it's slightly extreme, but it works. Okay. So that's worm one, okay, flatworms. And they had, again, some neat inventions. They're bilateral, they're triploblastic, they're motile, they're civilized. They have a gut, even though it's incomplete. The next worm example Nematoda. These are the roundworms. And I'll go through their, they're bilateral, they're triploblastic, they're motile. They are more circular, the name roundworm, whereas the flatworms are flattened dorsoventrally. These are more circular in cross-section. They have there's a couple of neat innovations that they have. They have a complete gut. And a complete gut means they have both a front end and a back end, a mouth and an anus. We'll talk about why that's such a great deal. Okay. And they have a secondary cavity, which is also, I don't know which is better, having a complete gut, but they're both pretty good. Okay. So, two things we haven't seen yet. The complete gut and the secondary cavity. And I'll explain what those are. First, the complete gut. So you have a worm here. You have a digestive system here. That's a complete gut versus the one that has an incomplete gut. So, I've already given it away that this is a better deal than this. Can somebody see why is that a better deal? Well, what does this animal gain and this one that this one can't have because it doesn't have a complete gut? Sir.
Right, well, you don't have to use the same orifice.
Which is aesthetically just gross, but other than that, right? Okay. Okay, eat more. Okay, yeah. Why is that?
It's more efficient because you don't have to use the same.
Right. So the stuff's coming out. And okay, that I never thought of that. Well, yeah, that's good. Okay, cool. I'll go along with that. Yeah. What else? It's sort of along that same thing. It's what you can eat and how you can process it.
All food's in front of you.
Okay, so when an animal eats food, it has to do all kinds of things. It has to break it down mechanically, break it down chemically by enzymes. It has to absorb it. It has to do all kinds of different things along the way. If you have an incomplete gut, the food's going to pass through the same area twice, right? So you can't be very specialized for mechanical breakdown because it's going to come back again, and you don't need a mechanical breakdown, you need chemical breakdown. By having a one-way gut, you can have differentiation of the gut. This part for mechanical breakdown, this for chemical breakdown, this for absorption, sort of a kind of an assembly line deal. Whereas this gut, the incomplete gut, you can't because it's going to go past the same place twice. Okay. Now, once you can have kind of a nice, efficient processing, what does that mean about what you can eat? You can eat more different things. You can eat things that are bigger, more complicated, because you now have the machinery to process that food in an efficient way. And the nematodes weren't the first group to invent it, but they're one of the earliest groups to invent the complete gut. Okay. Secondary cavity. What do we mean by that? If you look at flatworms, here's a cross-section of a flatworm. And here's the gut. And the rest of it is solid with cells and such. Okay. So here's the gut. Now that's the flatworm. Okay, this is the nematode roundworm. It also has a gut, but it has another space outside the gut. Okay, so it has cells and tissue here, and you've got cells and tissue here, and then it has this secondary cavity. And that is filled with fluid. Okay. It can be, okay. It's called and I didn't make up the word, but it's called pseudocoelom. And we know that pseudo means false. There's nothing false about it. The only reason they put pseudocoelom because other worms have another kind of coelom, and they said, well, that's not the same, so we're going to call this a false coelom. So it's just a name. The important thing is it's a secondary cavity lying outside the gut. Now, virtually every other animal, including us, have that same cavity or similar. Okay. It's hugely important for several reasons. For the worm, if this thing is filled with water, fluid, it's just like the difference between it provides a structural support, a skeleton. Okay. This thing is filled with water. That makes this thing able to support itself against the weight of gravity. In the same way, if you fill a balloon with water, as the water fills up, it's expanding out against the tension of the rubber pushing in, and you create a rigid structure, right? That's what this does. You're basically creating a water balloon. That provides structure. It provides a place where muscles can contract against. In fact, we call that water-filled secondary cavity, we call that a hydroskeleton. You can't have a hydroskeleton without a secondary cavity, so that's a huge invention. Also, this space can be filled with other things. It can be filled with eggs, so that you don't have to produce, every time you produce an egg, you don't have to lay it right away. You can store the eggs, which you can see how that could be useful, because then you can save them to lay when the conditions are right. It creates space for organs to expand into, so you can have more complicated digestive organs, because they have room to kind of grow inside this cavity. So there's a lot of advantages of having the secondary cavity. The nematodes were one of the first organisms to have that. Okay, so these two things are huge. They're huge for the nematode, and they're huge for the rest of the animal kingdom. Now, what do they do? Well, they're virtually found everywhere. They're found aquatic, marine, freshwater, on the ground, under the ground, inside plants and animals. And they come in two flavors, basically. There's the free-living nematodes. And these are mostly found in the soil. And they're small, less than a millimeter in length. And they basically eat detritus, decomposing plant and animal material, and you extract the nutrients, get rid of the non-nutrients. So they're happy doing that. But then you have a lot of endoparasites. All hookworm, heartworm, some of the nastiest parasites that affect animals and humans belong to the nematodes. So they're animal parasites, they're plant parasites. The plant nematodes probably cost the American farmer probably $6 to $8 billion a year in loss in crop damage. So they're huge economic importance, okay? Okay, so that's worm 2. Worm 3. Annelida. These are these segmented worms. Bottom. Okay. Now, so, the first list we can say, okay, we're not going to stop saying this after a while. Okay, they're definitely bilateral. It's going to be, and they were cephalized. Most of them are cephalized. Lots of sense organs. Lots of nervous tissue. They're triploblastic. 3 cell layers. They also have a secondary, they have a complete gut. They have a secondary cavity outside the gut. It's not homologous with that. You guys, have you heard about homologies and analogies? Have you got? Okay. So this cavity is homologous with the cavity found in segmented worms. It has the same function. It's filled with fluid, providing a hydrostatic skeleton. It's a storage space for eggs and other things. So they have the same function, which means they're analogous, but it's derived from a totally different way. So they're not homologous. Okay. And this one's called a coelom. The O is silent. So it has the same advantages to the segmented worm as it did to the round worm. It's just derived from a different structure. Okay. Now so what kind of advancements does this have over a roundworm? Well, one thing, this guy's motile and it moves by contracting muscles, but it only has longitudinal muscles. So if this is the worm here, the muscles run parallel to the body axis, right? Along, longitudinal, from front to back. Well, they're motile, but they have both longitudinal muscles and circular muscles. Okay, the longitudinal muscles again run up and down, the circular run around like this. They wrap around. Now, why is that an improvement? Well, longitudinal muscles, basically all you can do is you can get shorter and longer. So if you've ever seen roundworms move in fluid, they basically kind of flop around, and they get from point A to B not very efficiently, but they get there. Because they only have one kind of muscle. These kinds of muscles, accompanied by two other things, they have segments. They're segmented. So if you look at a worm here, here's the front end. They have segments, and these segments are kind of isolated from each other. They're not the same as those proglottids of the tapeworm. Forget that, those aren't segments. Those are just asexual buds. Okay, these are segments, and they have their own longitudinal muscle here, and then circular muscle, each of these. And they can contract those independently of each other. Okay. So when they contract the longitudinal muscles, the thing gets short. But when they contract the circular muscles, they get longer. They push up, just like you take the water balloon, your hand on, squeeze it, it shoots out. Well, they do the same thing. That pushes the water in the hydrostatic skeleton towards the front. Now, they have these little hooks, these things called setae, that helps them anchor. Has anybody ever, well, okay, I gotta remember. Okay, how many people have been fishing before? What a ridiculous question. Trust me, I asked that same question when I taught in Philadelphia. Nobody raised their hand. Okay. So we know, and you've used worms, right? You turn a worm upside down, and now this gets a little trickier. You rub it kind of right here, and you feel little little pricklies. Okay, those are little spikes called setae. Ouch. Okay, those setae can go in and out, so that when the animal pushes forward, they're pulled in, and then when it's ready to go, then the setae stick out, forcing the animal forward. Okay, I love this. Are you guys looking at earthworms in the lab? They're cool. Okay. But anyway, okay. So you have segmentation, circular and longitudinal muscles, these setae, that all helps them move. They're really good at moving very efficiently. Okay. Efficiently. Okay. Also, these guys have things that the roundworms don't. They have a circulatory system, okay? A closed circulatory system. Meaning they have a heart. Actually, they have 5 mini hearts. Hearts plus vessels. Much like we do. We don't have one heart, but we have blood flows through the vessels. So they have a closed circulatory system. They have hearts, they have vessels, they have a brain towards the front end, sophisticated nervous system, cephalization, the whole 9 yards. Now the first of these annelids to evolve belong to the class Polychaeta. These are the marine worms. They're the most mobile, the most cephalized, okay? They have lots of anterior sense organs for touch, sight. There can be active predators where they can actually chase down and subdue other prey items. Fairly fancy schmancy, okay. They're mostly all marine. But from that group, evolved two fairly specialized the oligochaeta are basically the earthworms. They have a specialized habitat mostly, which is they're burrowing. They not only live in burrows, but they dig their own burrows. And they do so by contracting and relaxing their circular and longitudinal muscles, poking their CD in and out, allows them to burrow. Are they going to be more or less cephalized than their polychaeta ancestors? Less. Clicker, clicker, clicker. Okay, great. Less, okay? Why is that? Whoever said less? Somebody else explain why.
It's in the dirt.
So, what's wrong with dirt? What is dirt lacking?
Everything is
There's not a lot of environmental cues in the underground. There's some, but not a lot. It's dark constantly, this and that. Okay, so they have reduced cephalization. It's not completely gone, but it's reduced. Okay. Then we have probably the most special. Okay, so these are the marine worms. These are basically the earthworms, although some of them now live in fresh water. Most of them are earthworms. And these are the leeches. Now they're mostly aquatic. There's some terrestrial, and their specialization has to do with how they obtain nutrients. They are ectoparasites. Okay, the roundworms are endoparasites. The tapeworms are endoparasites. The flips are parasites. Those are all internal parasites. These are ectoparasites. Now, they feed off the outside of an animal. Remember I said usually when you're an endoparasite, that means a reduction in cephalization, sense organs. What about ectoparasites? You have increased cephalization. Because for them to be able to be an ectoparasite, feed off the nutrients of usually blood, a host, they have to be able to detect the host. And so they have heat receptors that can detect, 0.02 plus or minus degrees centigrade. Okay, very finely tuned. They have chemoreceptors that can detect a molecule per cubic meter to smell out the prey. Not only that, their saliva is a veritable medicine chest of pharmaceuticals. Okay, so they have, of course, if you look at the front end, you have a mouth that has an opening here, and then it has a very hard tooth-like structure. Suction cups. They land on the outside of whatever post. The first thing they do, they start scratching a hole in the skin. The saliva contains a painkiller, right? A topical painkiller. Obviously, if you're going to try to make a living, the last thing you want is the host to recognize that you're there, right? Because they'll try to rub it off. So they spit saliva that has this painkiller in it. They also have vasodilators. Hirudin is an anticoagulant, because if the blood coagulates, they can't get to it, right? They can't pick up a blood clot. The blood has to keep on flowing. So they spit an anticoagulant called hirudinin, and this is used for stroke patients to prevent clotting. They have a vasodilator to expand the diameter of the host's blood vessels to get more blood flow through. They have an bactericide which prevents bacteria from, because bacteria will elicit an immune response which will stop the flow of blood, and so they don't want that either. Okay, so they have all these things: an antiseptic, a vasodilator, an anticoagulant, a painkiller, and they will spend days on a host, which is a good thing because these animals sometimes don't feed for up to 18 months because they can't chase down their prey, especially if they're terrestrial when living on. So they have to wait for them to come to them. So they really take advantage of it. Okay. So with that pleasant thought, I'll see you on Friday.